And our next speaker is Taylor Barnes. Taylor is an Atlanta-based journalist and a field reporter for the military-industrial complex with Inkstic Media, a nonprofit outlet that covers global security, while as a matter of policy, taking no funds from defense contractors or government entities that could color its views. Very rare in that field. You can follow her stories in the Inkstic's free Substack newsletter, Military Industrial America. Taylor, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Emma Claire, for having us. And Van, that was terrific. And my presentation is going to be extremely different because I am going to dive into the hyperlocal. But I think this will be relevant for the people on this call who I imagine often have, a long history in peace movements in their localities, and that's sort of the heart of my beat. And so, sort of just to give like some color to the origin story of this beat as I became interested in endless war as a defining feature of American life, as I was, mired in student debt and doing crazy things, attempting to get myself out of debt and wondering, what the US spent its money on, if not, educating its young people. I began to listen into the likes of Bill Hartung and read his books and many peers, and felt like I kept hearing this sort of common line, which was, we can point out everything that's wrong with the F-35 and why it's nuts to spend this much on a fighter jet that like isn't even capable of flying like the majority of times, or like we can tell you everything that's wrong with the ICBM, but nothing will change until the parochial politics around this changes. Like this is a matter of pork barrel politics playing out in the field, and that's why a key node in the military industrial complex, which is the congressional part, keeps the money flowing. So that's sort of the heart of my beat. And sort of just kind of diving into the trends that I'm watching in this Trump 2.0 era. I think as people on this call are very well aware of, you have your conventional big five defense contractors, the Northrop Grumman, the RTX, Lockheed, etc. And then these would-be insurgent players, the Anduril, the Palantir, the SpaceX, some of these Israeli startups that are coming to the US, um, calling themselves quote unquote defense tech, which is a term that Bill on this call has, disputed for a while and that I very much agree with. I.e., weapons manufacturers have always presented themselves on the cutting edge of technology. The defining feature of these firms is that they are venture capital backed and often Silicon Valley in origin. Um, and though they present themselves as an intention with each other, most clearly in Anduril's manifesto, which is published online, in which it claims that it's going to knock out the dinosaurs of the defense industry, like the Lockheed Martins. My prediction, my expectation, I imagine it's shared by many people here, is that everybody is going to do quite well in the Trump era and the era of the $1 trillion Pentagon budget. So as I dive into the hyperlocal, and first as I think of the rise, also just to say what I don't have a presentation, but I'm going to drop a few links into the chat for people who might want to just visualize what I'm discussing. As I think of the rise of the Silicon Valley venture capital backed weapons firms like Anduril, some places that I'm watching are, for example, right around the Trump inauguration, Anduril announced that Anduril claims that it will have one mega factory that produces its weapons, as opposed to a Lockheed Martin that spreads jobs and subcontracts and whatnot across as many congressional districts as possible. That's not really true. Anduril actually has, a production facility for UAVs here in the Atlanta area. It announced a solid rocket motor plant in Mississippi recently. That said, its would-be mega factory, it also announced within days of the Trump inauguration, and says it is going to build it in outside Dayton, Ohio. One remarkable thing about this is that Anduril, which likes to brag that it, invests in its own R&D rather than waiting for the Pentagon to subsidize its R&D, is getting an enormous amount of subsidies from Ohio taxpayers. It is well over $500 million, and that's just been what's publicly reported from both local and state level tax breaks, rebates, etc. And what's even more extraordinary about that is Ohio has a sketchy legal structure that allows it to deprive the public of its contracts to subsidize all subsidized companies, including Anduril, i.e., it uses an outsourced quasi-private nonprofit that's called Jobs Ohio that is not subject to public records law. Therefore, nearly $500 million, or well over $500 million, I believe, has already been, dedicated to this project to build Anduril's mega factory outside Dayton, Ohio, and the public is denied access to what are even the terms of that contract. So that's one thing I'm watching and here. And then this is me beating a dead horse, but it is just astounding, how much in local media the coverage of weapons plants is not in the context of a national security story. It's not in the context of even like a budget priority story. It is a jobs and economic development beat. So that right, what I just posted is an image of the front page of the I believe it's called the Columbus Daily News, the day that the governor announced that the largest job creation project in Ohio history has been achieved, and it is the Anduril drone plant outside Dayton. And what's remarkable about this is that the media publishes this uncritically, but does not, puts on the front page of the gigantic headline when literally, like, no one in the media is allowed access to the actual contract. Like, that 4,000 job claim sounds great, but like there's no one's allowed to actually see the fine print that like spells that out and like under what terms. And these like deals routinely underperform. So that's one thing I'm watching in the Trump 2.0 era is sort of the where these Silicon Valley backed firms announce their plans, and Ohio is an important place to keep an eye on. Another thing is just sort of the culture at contractors as they respond to, the Trump MAGA moment. We had this piece from our reporting fellow recently about these contractors, the likes of Boeing, Lockheed Martin, whatnot, that used to, for example, in their SEC forms, report their diversity statistics and used to sponsor, as amusing as this would be, used to sponsor things like local pride parades, have now backed off and are ceasing to do so, which, it can be amusing to think of the likes of Boeing sponsoring a pride parade. That said, it does mean something to workers on the inside. I had, for example, a queer employee at Northrop Grumman tell me, like, look, I don't even dare join the employee resource group for queer employees because I know the company doesn't have my back as soon as the Trump administration or Republican administration comes into office. And like, I don't want to out myself as queer in this company when like they will turn their backs on me as soon as it is not in vogue with the administration that they need to buy their wares. So I have my eyes on sort of a few cultural shifts along those lines. I've noticed a change in tenor of language from some of the likes of the more conventional defense contractors that I think if you look at the language from like an Andorra Palantir, I think it's very clear to read the right-wing politics into it. They're very clearly aligning themselves with Trump and the Republican Party, whereas the likes of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, et cetera, often had a more quote unquote bipartisan language. But I have noticed a bit more of the right-wing language in, for example, Twitter posts and whatnot from the big five contractors. Um, Another place to watch, this is this one just occurred to me right now, but is that of course the next generation fighter jet contract was announced, then which Boeing won, which will be largely produced in St. Louis, Missouri, which involves interesting local politics for this feat because St. Louis is a dense, heavy, generally blue town, very organized labor heavy, including at the Boeing plants. Um, it's also a place that's been sort of ground zero for Israel and Gaza genocide politics as AIPAC and the Israel lobby spent so much money to oust Cori Bush in favor of Wesley Bell. So we have a Missouri-based reporter who is really keeping their eyes on how this F-47 contract will be, discussed and promoted locally. Um, I wanted to now, I know many people on this call have an activist bent, so I wanted to hopefully offer a little bit of hopefulness about the ways that ordinary people are pushing back on endless war, and really just put a few, three things on your radar. Um, One is that um, so the private defense contracting is largely non-union nowadays. That did not used to be the case back during the Cold War. A place like Lockheed Martin had unionization rates like upwards of like 60 to 70%. These companies have largely beat back their unions. Anduril, Palantir, SpaceX all have zero union representation in the US. It's important to watch that Ohio plant and see if there's ever going to be any sort of organizing drive there. That said, the largest union at Pentagon contractors is the Machinist Union, and that really goes back to the Machinist Union being very tied in with aviation, including civilian aircraft manufacturing. And last year, right before the election, at the urging of a retiree in Connecticut at Pratt& Whitney, which makes engines for both military and civilian aircraft. The Machinists Union undertook an extensive report of essentially how their union could transition into the green jobs era. So, such an era did depend on the Democrats probably winning the White House. That said, it's a pretty remarkable move forward in a union that and rather the report does not say anything along the lines of we are demilitarizing, we are exiting the defense industry. What instead it says is it points out how many opportunities exist for this union in the clean energy and climate change, climate economy. So, for example, their vision of who, the machinist union, yes, has large numbers of unionized workers at Lockheed Martin and Boeing, but they also organize a lot of federal employees in general, including firefighters, and they imagined being able to, for example, organize like members of the Civilian Climate Corps and a Green New Deal. So I point this out. Similarly, the United Auto Workers at least has announced a just transition working group. Again, these are very uphill. That said, I think it is meaningful to hear organized labor, though they are a small minority of the private defense contracting workforce, speaking about what we, back in the Cold War would have been called economic conversion. This one is very, very special to me because I report often in Utah. Um, so the wealthiest religious organization with very much basically no comparison in the US is the Mormon Church, i.e., the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this only came to light in recent years thanks to a whistleblower from the investment arm of the church, several investigative reporters, etc. And in a first, a group of activist Mormons motivated by the genocide in Gaza are targeting the investment arm of the LDS Church with a letter writing campaign. They have said they've already sent 250 letters straight to Ensign Peak Advisors, which is the investment manager for the Mormon Church, calling on it to divest from several companies targeted by the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. And just to back up, the reason why this is significant is that most churches have long since not invested in the likes of a Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Northrop Grumman, which we've also discussed in our reporting. But because Ensign Peak and the LDS Church largely hit its finances by the time it was forced by the SEC to start reporting them publicly, it actually had those stocks in it and will publicly say awkward things like, oh, much of our investments is in broad portfolio funds. Don't read too much into it, even though most churches actually do very carefully manage what they call quote unquote the sin screens of their investments. So I find this very successful. I find this very interesting because Utah has had some important victories in disarmament. Many people on this call may remember the MX battle, in which very crucially the LDS Church came out against a mobile nuclear weapon from the Cold War that would end up being largely scrapped by the Reagan administration. So that's one thing I have my eye on. And finally, this is something that has been in the works. Several grassroots groups in locations that are tied up in what's known as plutonium pit production, so producing the cores of new nuclear warheads for the new nuclear arms race, sued the National Nuclear Security Administration, basically alleging that it had not done a sufficient environmental impact study of the impact of producing new plutonium pits in places like rural South Carolina, Los Alamos, and places tied up in it like Kansas City, Missouri, Pantex in Texas. And a judge agreed and told the NNSA they had to go back to the drawing table and do an extensive, laborious environmental impact study. And what this means is that the public is getting many chances to interface with the national security state, with the nuclear weapons, with the NNSA, and forcing them to listen in mass listening sessions. And frankly, slowing down the process of making plutonium pits, which didn't seem to be going very quickly anyway. But I find this to be, it's remarkable in just the sort of David and Goliath nature of it. I mean, these were tiny watchdog groups, like I said, from rural South Carolina, from Lawrence Livermore in the Bay Area, et cetera, that had this major legal win. and indeed are throwing a speed bump in the new nuclear arms race. So I know people on this call come from a variety of places that indeed have their own tentacles in the military-industrial complex. So please put anything in the chat or send me any story ideas. Thank you.
Teach-ins like this are a useful way to share expert perspectives with our communities and organizing groups, and we want to empower you to organize your own. We started the Teach-In Network as campus protests were being villainized across the country, as Bill just mentioned. And so our goal is to help make organizing a teach-in safe and easy. We provide resources and connect you with vetted expert speakers. The network is comprised of toolboxes that include primers, presentations, videos, and more. And of course, access to experts, many of whom are listed on our website, which I will post in the chat now. Here's a link with many of our speakers who have already agreed and are waiting on emails from us asking them to join a teach-in. We just organized an in-person one in Tucson that's going to be happening in a couple weeks. So I urge you, even if you never have, to take the next step and organize your own teach-in for your local organizing group or student group or whoever you meet with regularly or organize with. Please reach out to me via the Teach-In Network website, which you can get to through that link I just posted, or email me anytime at ryan@rootsaction.org if you want to organize with us. Thank you, and back to you, Emma Claire.